Welcome to the Cherish and Conquer podcast, the show dedicated to celebrating female entrepreneurs' strength, resilience, and innovation. Be inspired by stories of women and what they cherish to help them conquer against all odds. Every other week, you will learn from remarkable women on how they navigate challenges, uphold their values, and create sustainable success. And now, here's your host, Jim Rembach.
Hello and welcome to the Cherish and Conquer podcast. We're getting ready to talk to somebody who has one of the most unique titles to their book. And so needless to say, when you have a unique title and when we start talking about the context of what it is, the information in it is just as exciting. It really is. When you start thinking about what we want to do as far as making a difference in the world and how we go about doing it. And to me, this is, and I think even I read somewhere this is kind of like a how-to guide on how to actually start a sustainable, focused business, which is, I think, more and more, people are looking to do business with organizations that aren't just trying to do good in the world, but trying to do good for the world, right? And we have Maisie Ganzler on the show with us today. Maisie, welcome.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Now, before we actually get into, some of these how-tos and how to, really make a difference, for the world, not just in the world, is tell us a little bit about how, you're making a difference, with the work that you're doing today.
Well, I have just wrapped up a 30-year career with Bon Appetit Management Company, which was the fodder for much of the book, along with 12 interviews that I did. And I'm now in the really luxurious position of being able to spend time how I want to spend time. And what I'm choosing to do is reach out to my community, my business community, and see if I can help young people or young companies on a path towards profitability through sustainability. So I'm able to give my time away in many different arenas, all to that end.
Okay. So, for me, when you said that, I start thinking about, startup and how we may have, a very altruistic, type of approach and more societal approach. And then sometimes reality kicks in.
Yeah, there's a book on the New York Times bestseller list right now called Burn Book by Kara Swisher, who was is a longtime journalist covering the tech sector. And the first line of her book is, "And so it was capitalism after all." Referring to just what you're talking about, that when companies often start out, and many of the companies in the internet age fall into this category, they're going to save the world. And then it turns out it's capitalism after all. I posit that you can actually do both. You can work towards saving the world and you can make money, but you have to be very strategic about that and make some very intentional choices.
Okay. So thanks for teeing me up, because I think that's a great, segue to actually reveal the title that you have of the book. And is that "You Can't Market Manure at Lunchtime." And when you first glance that, it's one of those double, triple take types of scenarios. And you're like, well, heck, that makes perfect sense.
I think that's what the publisher was hoping for, that you would double take when you see the book on your shelf or on the shelf of a bookstore.
Well, and so I guess the subtitle is "And Other Lessons from the Food Industry for Creating a More Sustainable Company." But then in in the jacket it says 5 invaluable lessons for doing sustainability right, doing it profitably, and getting the credit you deserve. There's a lot of different lessons. You talk about the 5 lessons that are in the book. It says how to pick your battles and so on and so forth. And people need to get the book in order to get the detail. But for us as listeners and watchers of the podcast is, kind of give us an understanding of, you said, get it right. What does that really mean, right? Get it right by me, or what, how do we get it right? And then therefore go down the path that hopefully is making that impact?
Well, the purpose of the book is to teach people to achieve a dual goal, the goal of making real change in the world, be that environmental or social, and getting market credit for it. So doing it right first starts off with actually making change, not greenwashing, not being simply aspirational, but actually doing the work that creates leverage, that makes a difference for people or the planet. And then can you talk about that right? Can you do the marketing piece right so that you are rewarded in the marketplace for those actions?
Now let's talk about rewarded. What does rewarded mean?
Rewarded could mean market share. It could mean greater revenues. It could mean a higher price for your product. It could mean that people buy your product more often. It could mean that people want to come and work for you and stay longer. There's lots of rewards for doing it right.
All right, then your rebuttal to, well, it is just capitalism after all.
Well, I would not refute her take on much of the internet businesses that she is reporting on. I do think that it turns out it was capitalism after all for many of those companies. But I think that there is another set of companies, the Patagonias, Ben and Jerry's, Chipotle's of the world, who have shown that it can actually be to your market advantage and it can be part of your brand to make change.
Okay, now when you throw out those names, it's like, huh, well, they're huge, big market cap. I mean, it's like, it's just lowly me, with a mission and a passion, and how do I actually get to the point to where, I can at least make maybe a little, dent, in the universe, versus universal impact.
Yeah. Well, of course, they didn't start out huge. They started out small. And all of those companies that I mentioned had that ethos from their very beginning. So it's baked into how they do business. And that's lesson 2 of my book is about it. Maybe you should change your dream. I came from a company that had a dream rather than a mission statement. And when we started down this path towards sustainability as market differentiation, we actually rewrote the dream. We rewrote the very essence of who the company is. And so if you start with that, with thinking about having a really honest conversation with yourself about is sustainability or DEI or whatever good you're trying to do in the world really core to your company, then even when you're just a sole proprietor, you have a different mindset than when I get big enough or profitable enough, I will do good in the world. That's more philanthropy. I'm talking about something that's really core to how you operate.
I think that's a very helpful differentiation because that exploration oftentimes doesn't happen. And that's sometimes when reality kicks in.
Yeah. Now, that said, the first chapter is actually, the first lesson is how to pick your battles, because we can't do everything, right? When we're small, we have constrained resources, time and money. And it turns out when we're large, we also have constrained resources, time and money. When I started with Bon Appetit, we were at about 94 million in revenue, 1,200 employees. Now 1.7 billion and 20,000 employees. And I'll tell you, there's constraints at both sizes. So you can't do everything. You've got to be strategic about the issues you take on, where you can make real change through your practices, where you are big enough or at a certain inflection point in the supply chain or working with a certain population where you can make real change and you can tell a story about it.
Okay, so I mean, for me, I'm thinking about the entire, let's just say, process and therefore ecosystem in all of this. Mm-hmm. And then you start thinking about movements and communities and, all of the pieces that have to be planned. Some are going to be surprises. Some have to be intentional. If I think about it from a maturation process perspective, how can I be realistic to say, okay, I don't need to be looking at, this, and this right now. That's going to come later down the road. I need to focus in right here. Otherwise, I'm not going to get forward movement.
Yeah.
How do you go through that process?
Well, let me give you a real life example from somebody I spoke to for the book, Ernie Farley, who's a partner in a farm called Good Farms. And when I say a farm, I mean a multinational farming operation, not one little farm. And he talks about the stance that they've taken around labor. And conversely, he says, it would be a fool's errand for me to take on packaging. Now let's get into both of those, why one is something that they've taken a stand on and one is a fool's errand. So first and foremost, they have control of how they treat their workers. They set their own pay rates. They set their schedules. They train their supervisors. They have control of, within, of course, a legal framework of how they treat farm workers. Secondarily, one of their largest customers, Costco, brought in all of their top suppliers and said, we want someone to take a leadership position on labor. So that business light bulb goes off. My big customer wants me to do this, and I have the control to be able to do it. I can execute it. Now, the details, of course, are complicated and expensive, and it's hard to do. I'm not trying to oversimplify that, but the decision is clear. Conversely, he says, in packaging, if I wanted to take on plastics, he says, that's a fool's errand for one company to take on. There are too many systems that are entrenched that expect packaging to be a certain way. If I start changing my packaging, I've got to get every customer to take my packaging in a different way. It's going to affect the shelf life of my product. That affects the economics in a different way. So packaging, and no customers asking me to make that change, packaging is not a good place to start.
Want more insights from female entrepreneurs? Get complimentary access to Marina's Army for additional tips, tools, and tactics from this episode. Just go to Marina.ai and click Community for access. Now, let's get back to the conversation.
Okay. So now this is where I think it's be very helpful to talk about what you addressed and what you shared initially in regards to that you were with Bon Appetit organization for many years and how you've now decided to move down this path. So what has inspired you to do that, and how does it align with the concept of cherish and conquer?
Well, I feel so lucky to have found a corporate home for 30 years and a CEO in Fidel Bauchio, who is a true mentor and partner, and we accomplished so much together. I feel so grateful for that. Truly, truly grateful. That said, after 30 years, or I should say after 29 years, I started to look at what do I want the next phase of my life to look like? And I want to have some other experiences. 30 years in one company means 30 years in one industry with a very specific focus on one vertical. I think I have transferable skills. I'd like to stretch my wings and try out some other arenas of business. But I couldn't imagine having another job. I felt, again, so lucky to have found this great place and this great boss. I couldn't imagine going to work for somebody else. So I spent about a year in transition, gave Fidel a full year's notice to say that I'm going to retire. I'm going to leave when everything is great. On a high note, I'm going to set my team up for success. And I'm going to remain connected to the company. So I've stayed on as a strategic advisor. I spoke to Fidel just this week about a new waste tracking technology. So I've still got my hand in it, but I've got much more freedom to cherish and conquer. And cherish, for me right now, means cherishing experiences and some ability to breathe, some latitude, to explore, to be able to be a little bit more languid and take my time in things. And I'm really cherishing that experience. But I also think that I can help others to conquer. As I said, I don't want another job. But I have reached out to several different organizations, something called Santa Cruz Works in my hometown, Plug and Play Tech Center. I've signed up into both of their mentorship programs. I sit on advisory boards of several companies, and I've got that ability now to help others achieve their goals and their dreams.
That's awesome. And thank you for sharing an enviable position to be in. And I'm sure there's some very, very lucky organizations that are going to be, meeting you and getting some incredible mentorship. Now, when you start talking about that 30-year journey, I think the part that's quite interesting for, people who have gone through that path, is entrepreneurial type of endeavors and thinking can be frightening because you have the security of, a stable job. You have the security of the people who are around you. I mean, all of the things that, like you were saying, you built a deep skill set within that. And a lot of people would say, you know what? I'm too afraid to go outside of that. Mm-hmm. You didn't do that. Right. So, but I would dare to say you still had some thought process that you had to go through in order to come to that conclusion. So how did you actually go from, stable, secure, and then even start considering doing what you're doing now?
Well, I think that the obvious place to talk about worry leaving a secure situation is about money. But money is actually the easy part of the decision. It's numbers. You put your budget together, you do your forecasting. Either you've got the financial means to go out on your own or you don't. The part that I think is actually a more squishy problem is about identity. Who are you? I had a big job title, a C-level job title for a lot of years, right? And I had a lot of people who worked for me, and with that becomes a certain person to move through the world as. And so for me, the greater question has been, who am I moving through the world as without that C-level title? Who am I without the daily grind? And that was a part of the impetus of writing the book. And I'm putting a lot of time into talking about the book on podcasts such as this, where I get to have really in-depth, great conversations that go in interesting directions. I'm doing a lot of webinars for advocacy groups and business groups, and really trying to do something every single day, still in the professional realm, even though I'm not getting paid per se, because that is a big piece of who I am. And I don't want to leave all of that behind.
As you say, that's like compensation comes in many forms.
Absolutely. Well said.
So, okay. Part of what we're talking about here, and it's really interesting because you were talking about dream. We hear, and so I think that it would be helpful to understand, because we have mission, vision, purpose. All these different things. Now you're saying dream, and it's like, okay, we need to be a little bit more succinct, and I need to be able to have something that I can stand on. So help us understand kind of like the nuances or the differences between the two, and where I need to draw some lines so that I can, find that organizational motivation, that everybody wants to become part of.
Well, the reason that Fidel, when he founded the company in 1987, wrote a dream rather than a mission statement is that he wanted people to make an emotional connection to it. And a mission seemed more tactical and surgical, as opposed to a dream, which is big and soaring and it fills your heart. And he's a very passionate man, and he wanted to inspire passion in others. As far as dream versus mission versus vision versus purpose, I think pick whatever speaks to you and just move forward. Let's stop splicing words and arguing about it. Let's set a vision or a purpose and let's get on with it.
Well, I think that's very helpful because, I mean, so many times there's just conflicting information and all these different perspectives that gets thrown out. And sometimes we just need clarity, just like you're saying, just get on with it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of communications consulting companies have made a lot of money getting people to splice those into different categories. Get to the work, get to making the money.
I hear you. Okay, so picking your battles. Give us a story or an understanding or an insight into picking your battles.
Well, when you sit down and say that you want your company to be based on sustainability, I think there's two approaches. First is to pick a singular battle, one issue, and really own it. And the second is to be known as generally sustainable. I'll give an example from the food world in both. Impossible Burgers, people are probably familiar with, was the brainchild of a Stanford professor, Pat Brown, who decided that the single most important thing that he could do to stem climate change was get people to eat less beef. So it's a very specific, targeted focus. Eat less beef, and because of climate change. There's been criticisms of Impossible around the use of genetically modified ingredients or the high levels of sodium. But he was not out to create a healthy product. He was not out to deal with the issues of genetic modification and seed saving. He was very focused on one battle, climate change. Now, conversely, you look at a company like a Whole Foods, which is generally sustainable. They do talk about genetically modifications. They talk about organic and pesticide use. They talk about pollinators. They talk about the buildings they operate in. They talk about their employees, this whole host. So the first thing of picking your battle is deciding how many battles you're picking and how that defines your brand.
So as you're saying that, I start thinking about carbon footprint and carbon credits and all this other stuff. I mean, is that just money-making stuff? Or, I mean, is that really, I mean, people look at that and says like, well, what does it matter? You're just going to buy the credits and try to make somebody happy that thinks that that's an issue.
Well, your carbon footprint is a real thing for sure. Or in the food world, we often say your carbon food print. And the impacts on carbon from the creation and use and disposal of your product, be it a carrot or a computer or a widget, is real. And there's real science behind that. Now, the idea of carbon credits is more controversial. Not that it can't exist, but that there have been many projects that have been sold as carbon offsets that have proven to not really be taking carbon out of the atmosphere, or the concept that a company can continue to spew carbon and just buy their way out of it. That said, there's been a lot of work done in that industry, and I think that there are rating systems on carbon credits now. So if you want to take that route, there are better and worse ways to do it. What we did at Bon Appetit was focused on reducing our carbon impacts rather than offsetting them.
Okay, so when you start thinking about making this, impact on the world, give you a couple examples like you were talking about. Moving to EVs. Well, nobody's really talked about these batteries in the end of life, right? Mm-hmm. Wind turbines. Well, nobody's really talking about all these blades that are piling up, that are no longer usable. They had to be replaced. I mean, you start talking about, all of these consequences of us trying to save the planet when we're actually just, moving things to a different pile or problem pile. So if you think about that from a societal perspective, are we potentially on the decline of societal interest because they're like, you know what? It's all capitalism anyway, or we're just creating one waste problem because of another waste problem. Are people kind of getting exhausted on this?
Well, I think people are getting exhausted, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're at a decline in interest. I think that people are confused and people are tired, but that if you can present a really clear message with great proof behind it, you can still speak to a large percent of the population that cares about these issues. Not 100%, but a large percent. There's been a lot of pushback on ESG investing and wokeism. That doesn't mean that there aren't millions of people that are concerned about the direction of our planet, millions of people that want more equity in our systems. So let's talk to those customers. There's plenty of them.
That's a great point. It doesn't have to be a complete consensus, right?
Right.
We don't have to look any further than the U.S. political system to know about that.
Or, I mean, we started off talking about really small companies, right? 1, 2, 3 people. In that case, don't worry about the whole population. If they all want you, you're not going to sell to them. You don't have enough bandwidth, right?
That's a great point. Great point. Okay. So, can you share an example of when staying true to your principles led to a significant achievement or breakthrough in your business?
Well, when we first rewrote the dream and we wrote sustainability into the dream, we went across the country and had a roadshow with our chefs and managers and said, this is the new dream. And Fidel told everyone to go out into their communities and find small farmers and start purchasing differently. And at the time, our employee base was really behind us. They were actually emotional meetings with people saying, this is how I cook at home. This is how I feed my family. And to be able to bring my values to work feels so good. However, there was a big but. Well, they said, I care about these things. My clients don't. No one's ever going to pay more for it. No one's ever going to buy our business based on these. They don't care about it. Well, that was 2004. Fast forward, every single request for proposal that we get has a sustainability section. And when they first started, those questions started appearing. Honestly, they were pretty ill-conceived questions from people that didn't really understand the issues, but were trying to say, is there something out there? Now, they're really sophisticated questions that no one can answer better than Bon Appetit Management Company, because we've been at it for 20 plus years, because we've built the systems and we have the data at the ready. So it was a great business breakthrough when we stood true, even in the face of our own people who said, this is not a business initiative.
That's a great point. So I think the integration, like to me, what you were talking about is that integration of my values, what's important to me, and the organizational values is what occurred. And I think that's, probably when you start looking at making change that's sustainable within an organization, you've got to master that.
Absolutely. And I think that's why right now a lot of companies who made commitments to DEI post George Floyd's murder are stumbling, because they didn't really have that alignment within the organization. It was a knee-jerk reaction to a national crisis, but they didn't have that alignment, and it's showing now.
That reminds me of a situation where I was working with a very large global client that was in the major appliance arena. And we were doing some customer experience measurement for the organization that I was working for at the time. And there was an uproar over the weekend that occurred because information had gotten to a higher level executive that a person was unable to get served in customer service because their language that they were calling in, that was a primary language, wasn't supported. And so they went through this huge, massive change initiative to be able to address that one person.
Yeah, I'll give you the flip side also. When there's not alignment, we had a large tech client that had somebody who wanted to put forth a wellness initiative. So somebody in the HR team wanted to put forth a wellness initiative. And we're very supportive of it. And the first action was to move the candy away from the cash registers, right? On day one, somebody complained that the M&Ms were not at the cash registers. Now, mind you, the M&Ms were still in the cafe. You could still buy them. They were still in the vending machines, but they weren't at the cash registers. And right away, they told us to put the candy back at the cash registers because the person who accepted customer complaints was not on board with the HR's department's wellness initiative. They were being incented on happy customers and on customer service scores, not on wellness. And that unalignment or misalignment, I guess is the word, meant that those M&Ms flew back to the register.
It's amazing how that happens.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that brings up a really interesting point when you start talking about, customer habit, customer familiarity, customer expectation, and then standing your ground and saying, you know what, this is our identity. This is who we are, and we're standing in this spot for a reason. And therefore, kind of like what we were saying a moment ago, if somebody doesn't want to buy into it, it's okay.
Mm-hmm. We had some conflict with a couple customers over our sustainability stances. And what was most important to me, where I drew the line, is we weren't going to compromise our practice. What I would compromise was the marketing of it. And what I mean by that is, for example, we had a commitment to cage-free eggs from hens that aren't kept in bear and battery cages. Well, we had a university that had a donor that had a caged egg farm. So of course, they don't want to see a lot of talk about cage-free eggs. We said, that's fine. We don't have to talk about it at all on your campus. No marketing of it, not on the website, not called out on menus. You will see no mention of it anywhere. Now, we're still going to buy the cage-free eggs because it's still the right thing to do. And the most important piece is making the change in the lives of the hens, right? Not about talking about it. Now, that worked about 95% of the time, I would say, that when there was a conflict, as long as we just toned down the rhetoric, stopped talking about it, we could continue on with our action. There were a couple rare exceptions where we just had a fundamental disagreement about how we saw the world with a customer. And at that point, you agree to disagree and part ways in a friendly manner, right? Not doing business together doesn't have to be the end of the world. It's just the end of that business relationship.
I think that's a really hard thing for people to resolve themselves upon, is that, sometimes, and somebody who I had interviewed a moment ago talks about meshing.
Mm-hmm.
Is it, didn't necessarily want to talk about fit or things like that. It was like mesh. Do we mesh? Because to me, that's a much better visual associated with, doing business with an organization, and making it to be a long-term type of relationship. It's really a meshing.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I would often say when we did sales proposals that the details can all be changed. If you don't like this menu, if you don't like these hours of operation, we can work that all out. But do you want to work it out with us? Like, are we the right people to be having this conversation? Do you want to work shoulder to shoulder together? Because if so, we can make the rest of it come together.
That's a great point. And as you were talking, I'm thinking about some of the agreements that I was having to, or that I have, some depending on the type of business. I have found that if you can actually get a contract that is just 2 pages versus 20, it's going to be a better relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah. Trust goes a long way, right?
Most definitely. Most definitely. Okay. So now when you start talking about, being able to have a dream, make a stance, and do all that stuff, sometimes you just come to the conclusion that you do have to make a pivot.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start talking about needing to make that pivot because new information becomes available to you and whatever, case may be, how do you handle something like that? Because part of the book, you talk about how to tell your story. Well, what happens if your story kind of shifted?
Well, I think your story probably is going to shift. And lesson 4 of the book is actually about what to do when you fall short. And I promise you, you will fall short. If you're trying to create a brand based on sustainability, you're going to take leadership position, and this stuff is hard, and there's a lot of factors, and sometimes, somewhere, something's going to go wrong, and you're going to have to pivot. Or you just learn something new and you make a change. And I would say that the absolute most important thing is to be transparent, and probably at a level that's uncomfortable. So I would say radically transparent. I had an experience of, we were making change away from pork from sows that are raised in gestation crates. And that's a lot of technical words. It's pens that pregnant pigs are put in, and they're inhumane. We had committed to moving away from them. We had a supplier who said that they were eliminating gestation crates. I went out and I told everybody that we had achieved this. I spoke at conferences. I talked to advocacy groups. I was out bragging that we were the first company to figure this out. Well, lo and behold, it turns out we hadn't figured it out, that our supplier had actually misled us, I would say intentionally. My first phone call when I hung up with that supplier was to the Humane Society of the United States to say, hey, this thing that I told you we've been doing, where we've been getting all these kudos for having achieved it, turns out those pigs are still in gestation crates for a month. We have not eliminated gestation crates. We have reduced the time. And that's not what the letter of what I was saying was. It's not the letter of my commitment, nor is it the spirit of my commitment. I ratted myself out. I then did a press release on it, and I brought a reporter who really understood the issues to a pig farm. Nobody could criticize me because I told the story first.
Yeah, you were the first leak.
Right.
And I think that's important because a lot of times, it reminds me of a situation when COVID, when all the COVID eventual lockdown activities, came into play. And so we had these announcements and there wasn't any shutdown yet. And I started saying to this one organization that was actually scheduling an event around that time. And I was like, you need to start communicating this and get ahead of it. Well, no, we don't want to scare people if it doesn't happen. And I'm like, and sure enough, they delayed. And it backed themselves into a particular corner where if they would have got on the front end of it, it would have been less of an issue or a problem. So I think when you're talking about getting ahead, linking, making the adjustments and stuff like that, what would you recommend when you do have to make pivots, when you do have to make changes, when you do fall short? What would you recommend that people do? I mean, that's a great example of what you shared, but I'm sure there was other people telling you, no, don't do that, right?
Yeah. Well, Scott Galloway, who's a professor at NYU and a podcaster, Prof G, he has 3 steps that get you through a crisis, and I think he's got it right. Number 1 is acknowledge the issue. 2 is top guy or gal takes responsibility. And 3 is overcorrect. And I've watched many organizations do that well and not so well. An example going on right now, there was a AP investigation into slavery in the Indian shrimp industry. And it said that some certified products, or product that was certified as sustainable, actually had slave labor that went into producing it. Well, how did I hear about that? Because the certification sent me an email and said, this article is coming out today, and here's what it says about our certification. So they acknowledged the problem. They then set up a page on their website with that announcement about a week later with a letter from their CEO, top guy or gal taking responsibility, and then a week later with a set of actions they're taking to correct the problem. Now, the jury is still out to see if that's overcorrection or if it's not enough, right, where it's an active issue right now. But I was talking to a seafood NGO last week, and I said, "Oh, this thing happened. Are you going to make a statement? Are you going to come out and criticize them for having these loopholes in their systems that allowed slave labor to work in it?" And they said, no, we're not going to criticize them. We want to continue to work with them because they're trying to fix it. They're trying to shore it up. And that's what you do. You acknowledge the problem from the top, not scapegoat somebody below, which is kind of tempting to do, right? But the top person has to take responsibility and then overcorrect.
I think that's a great example. And then we can even, and from my perspective, take that all the way down, to the solopreneur level. I mean, things are going to happen, right?
Absolutely.
And it's sitting on them and trying to squash them is what we have proven over and again is where the problem.
They always say the cover up is worse than the crime, right?
Absolutely. Okay. So if I'm starting to talk about, one of the things that we hear a lot in regards to, I feel like I need to do and behave a certain way in order to be able to have that type of success. You may hear it as imposter syndrome and things like that. What advice do you give when women actually struggle with this in their business pursuits?
I was just speaking with a woman yesterday, actually, who talked about that imposter syndrome. And she is in financial services. And she said that she always thought that somebody in financial services looked and acted and spoke in a certain way. And so she tried really hard to do that. And in that industry, it has been heavily male dominated. It was a certain way of dressing she thought she had to do, and she's English is her second language, and a certain way of speaking that she thought she had to aspire to. And somebody gave her the great advice of saying, you're kind of like a puffer fish. You come off kind of blown up in this hard exterior. And when she thought about it, she realized that she was being an imposter, but an imposter of a straight white man financial advisor, not an imposter in terms of her skill as a financial advisor. And that if she actually came to the table as herself, and when I met her, she was wearing a fuchsia dress with ruffles on it. So she had really put herself into a very feminine presentation. But her skill in talking about what she does for her clients in estate planning came through much louder than even the bright fuchsia did. So I think that the trick to not feeling like an imposter is to truly be yourself.
Okay, so when we start talking about, you being within an organization for a long period of time and now doing your own thing, do you think you have some work to do in order to separate your identity from Bon Appetit?
I still can't get over the we statement versus the they statement, what we do versus what we did versus who they are. Absolutely. As I said, I'm still sitting as a strategic advisor. So there is still some we going on, but there's a lot more they than there used to be. And I, of course, I'm a loyal follower of their blog. And now that I've been gone a couple months, there's content coming up that I didn't approve for the first time in 30 years. Oh, wow. And so far, it's been fantastic to see what they are doing without me as being creative and new. And they've changed some things in ways that I go, oh, that's a great idea. I wonder if I had been there, if that would have happened, or if I would have squashed it. Great that they're getting to fly without me.
That's good. Oh, that's awesome. You see that you enabled some of their and some of their new content and new decisions, and I think that's awesome. Okay, so I think the landscape when you start talking about making a difference, telling your story, and how to go about it, and finding resonance, movements, all of those things, has probably changed significantly over those couple decades. When you start talking about when you first started and working with Bon Appetit and messaging and impact and engagement and all that versus where we are now. Where do you see some of the areas that are opportunities that people may not be necessarily seeing very clearly to take advantage of so that they can make that difference?
Well, I think that some people look at the number of commitments that have been made by large companies around things like climate change or diversity and say, like, there's no more differentiation to be have. Everybody's doing it now. All the companies are talking about climate change. I would say that there's actually opportunity in that, because I'll tell you that every large company has a climate commitment for 2030 or 2050, and no company is on track to make it. So if you can make it yourself, so take your company at whatever scale you are and be true to that commitment to truly become carbon neutral by 2030, you are going to differentiate yourself. And even better in terms of an opportunity, if you're selling into a larger organization, be it a product or a service, you become part of their solution. They need you to make their commitment. There's something called Scope 3 in climate accounting, which is the emissions from your supply chain. So they're responsible for all of your emissions. And if you're reducing, you are actually helping them reduce. And I would say if you're really innovative about it, you can wind up in their marketing materials, their sustainability report. They're going to brag about what you're doing. And once your pretty face is in their materials, it will be very hard to move away from you as a provider.
That's a great example. That's a fantastic example. Okay, so how are you planning on maintaining a healthy work-life balance in your new role compared to what you were having to go through being in charge of all of these people and all of these big responsibilities?
Well, I am having the internal conversation for the first time ever about when I go on trips, do I take my computer or not? The idea that I could go somewhere without my computer is like a totally new concept to me. And I'm actually tomorrow going to Glacier National Park and just got an email from the lodge saying that inside the park, there's no cell service. And for the first time in, decades, that doesn't scare me.
New experiences off the grid, right?
Right. Not only would no one be able to find me, no one's looking for me anymore.
But you're needed. Don't forget.
Enjoying the show? After joining Marina's Army, subscribe and share the Cherish and Conquer podcast on your favorite platform. Thank you. Now, back to the show.
Now we'd like to get a few rapid fire insights from you. You shared a lot of information with us in regards to your experiences and your perspectives and told some great stories. But we want to go through a little bit of breakthrough blitz with you. Are you ready to blitz?
Blitz on.
All right. So what's your favorite productivity tool or app?
I like Asana because I like to make lists and cross things off. And Asana has this ridiculous little feature that every once in a while, when you check off a task, you get a unicorn on a rainbow that shoots by. And somehow that reward works for me.
I know what you mean. I use Asana myself. Okay, so what's your favorite way to unwind after a busy day?
I like to take my dog to the beach and watch him run. I get great joy out of his athleticism. And he's a little dog, so it's kind of a surprise.
If you could have dinner with any female business leader, living or deceased, who would it be?
Well, I don't think that she's a business leader per se, but if you're going to give me a dinner with anybody famous, I'm going for Michelle Obama. I can't not.
Very good. What's your favorite quote or mantra that keeps you motivated?
That's a good one. My favorite quote or mantra. I would say the one that I've found myself saying the most, and actually on my last day, my staff all came on to Teams, with everybody wearing a t-shirt that had an iron on from one of my things that I say, which was super, super sweet. They'd been listening. But the thing that I think I say the most is, if this was easy, somebody would have done it already. So if you're in a leadership position, you're going to knock your head on a bunch of walls, because if it was easy, somebody would have done it already.
Very true. Okay, so what piece of advice would you give to aspiring female entrepreneurs?
I would say to aspiring female entrepreneurs, get very comfortable with who you are and your ideas, and listen. Sometimes I think that when we tell young women to speak their mind and to take a seat at the table and lean in, that can also have a dark side of not listening. I think you've got to do both.
Very good. Okay, this is my last Breakthrough Blitz question. What's the biggest misconception people have about being a female entrepreneur, and how do you address it in your own experience?
I think the biggest misconception that people have about me as a female business person is that I suffered not having children in exchange for work. And in fact, those are two separate choices that I made. And I think a choice that everybody has to make for themselves based on your vision of yourself. But for me, they were not linked.
Maisie Ganzler, great conversation. How do the listeners and watchers get in touch with you? MaisieGanzler.com, which is a lot of letters, MaisieGanzler.com. And the book, You Can't Market Manure at Lunchtime, is available on Amazon.com or through bookshop.org, so you can support your independent bookseller. Maisie, thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience, and we wish you the very best.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into the Cherish and Conquer podcast from Marina. Join our community of trailblazing women at community.marina.ai and get access to exclusive resources, checklists, and guides. If you found value in today's episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and share it across your social platforms. See you soon, and remember, barriers are for breaking.